Hello everyone. I'm sure that you have heard about the massive Chernobyl disaster that occurred in the Soviet Union in 1986. Today we will try to understand this whole disaster and why it happened. So after the Second World War ended, the Soviet Union started creating many nuclear power plants to meet their energy needs. And one of these many nuclear power plants was the Chernobyl power plant. The official name of this plant was the Vladimir Lenin nuclear power plant. It was created in the 1970s and soon became one of the most advanced and powerful plants that existed in the Soviet Union. The power plant had four nuclear reactors that together generated huge amounts of electricity. To further understand why this disaster happened, let's understand how the Chernobyl power plant worked. The way this power plant worked was similar to how any other nuclear power plant worked. A nuclear reaction heats up water, which creates steam. This steam is then used to move a turbine, which generates electricity. The water also cools down the whole process to avoid overheating. The Chernobyl power plant got its water supply from a nearby water body. To ensure consistent water supply to the reactors, water pumps are installed. However, these pumps work on the use of electricity as well, so diesel generators were installed. Now, these generators took 1 to 2 minutes to start, and the ground staff assumed that the steam in the chamber would power the pumps till the generators were starting. On April 25, 1986, the ground staff were testing to see this. These tests were successful on the other three reactors but had never been successful on reactor number 4. As you already might know, a nuclear chain reaction occurs that generates kinetic energy, and to slow down this chain reaction, something called control rods are used. These were made of boron carbide. Boron is an element that absorbs neutrons really well. This slows down the nuclear chain reaction as it stops neutrons from hitting other atoms. In the core of a nuclear power plant is a graphite monitor, which speeds up the nuclear fusion. Today, most nuclear power plants use water as their moderator, but in the Chernobyl power plant reactors, graphite was used as a moderator. That night, the ground staff were lowering the power output from 3200 megawatt to 1600 megawatt to eventually 700 megawatt for the test. However, the output came down really low to 30 megawatt. The reason for this was a byproduct named xenon 135. It was created during a reaction that slowed down the reaction just like boron does. Now, this xenon 135, which was a byproduct, got trapped inside the reactor, which dramatically reduced the power output. So they started taking out the control rods made of boron. The output was still very less, so they took out so many more and left only 8. This violated the protocol of leaving at least 15 control rods in the reactor at all times. Now, because of this sudden move, the power output skyrocketed, and because of the fast reaction, the byproduct xenon 135 that was slowing the reaction down was also gone. The power output suddenly became so much that the whole building started shaking and started becoming unstable. And because of this, the ground staff suddenly pressed the emergency stop button. The result of this was that all of the control rods would insert inside the reaction. This should have allowed the control rods to absorb neutrons and to dramatically slow down the reaction and the power output. This felt like a logical move to all of them and should have slowed down the reaction. But the control rods had a design flaw. A small part in the bottom of the control rods was made out of graphite, and the rest was made out of boron. And if you remember, graphite is a moderator that speeds the reaction up. So when the button was pressed, all the control rods having a graphite tip were inserted. This caused a massive blast. The graphite tip had sped up the already fast nuclear reaction. The power output of the reactor reached 33,000 megawatt. Following this blast, another, more powerful blast took place. All of the radioactive material in the reactor instantly started spreading in the atmosphere. The reason for the second blast was the burning of the graphite. After this, firefighters arrived at the power plant. They did not know what was going on, so they started pouring water, and even helicopters were called to pour water from the top. It took more than 10 days to put this fire off. The firefighters, after putting the fire away, felt radiation sickness for having too much exposure of radiation. Now, 10 days later, the fire was gone, but heat was still being produced and started cracking the base of the whole reactor. Under the base was stored radioactive water, and if the water got in contact with the heat, there would be yet another big blast more powerful than the previous two, spreading more radioactive material. So someone had to risk their life to dive in the radioactive water and drain it to avoid another big blast. Alexei Anenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov risked their lives and dove in the radioactive water to drain it. They were successful in this task and they drew all the radioactive water out and avoiding one of the largest radioactive explosions in the world. Fortunately, all three divers survived after diving in the radioactive water. The next step was to clean up the radioactive waste near the power plant. Thousands of people were sent to clean up the radioactive waste. The Soviet Union tried to hide this disaster from the rest of the world, but this wasn't something that could be hidden from the world so easily. The radioactive dust from this disaster was reaching as far as the country of Sweden. Monitoring stations in Sweden detected unreasonably high levels of radioactivity and found out the source of the disaster. Finally, the Soviet Union accepted to the world that it was a big disaster that occurred 2 days after the whole incident. To contain the radioactive dust, a structure was built on top known as the sarcophagus. It was completed 4 months after the disaster. Cracks started forming in the sarcophagus, and other structures were built on top of it. This disaster had a huge negative impact on the world, giving variants of cancer to thousands and also killing thousands of people. This is said to be a big reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union due to its huge expense. To avoid these kind of disasters in the future, scientists from around the world learned many lessons from this disaster and created the World Association of Nuclear Operators. Today, there exists a 30-kilometer exclusion zone, allowing no one except officials inside this disaster zone in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Thank you for listening.